I'm sure many of you whiskey fans out there have heard of or at least seen a bottle of Blanton's. And probably wondered to yourself, why is this so important? Why is this such an amazing whiskey that is kind of sought after? It's pretty hard to find. Well, let's talk about it. Grab a glass. So it turns out that Albert Blanton didn't actually own his own distillery, but he was a very well-known distiller for the George T. Stagg distillery. And although being a man of his own quirks, which I think most people are, they got their own things here or there, Albert Blanton was quite an interesting figure and quite well renowned in the whiskey world. Hence he has his own whiskey now. But what's very interesting was it wasn't his idea to actually make the Blanton's whiskey, and it was named after him because of a very interesting story that I want to tell you about. So as it turns out, the George T. Stagg distillery, originally the OFC distillery, is a distillery which has changed names over and over and over and over again and is now Buffalo Trace Distillery, was at one point owned by Freddie Falk and Robert Barnauskas. So these guys, when they bought the distillery in 1982, had kind of a dilemma. Whiskey was not so popular at the time, it was kind of fading away. And they were looking for a way to spice things up and to make a new whiskey for kind of like the higher bespoke whiskey drinker. Now, Blanton wasn't around anymore. In his stead, the distiller at the time for the George T. Stagg distillery was Elmer T. Lee. Now, you probably have also heard of Elmer T. Lee because he's got his own whiskeys, his name is on a few products. What I thought really stood out was when the distillery changed hands, Elmer T. Lee was asked, hey, what is a good whiskey story? What is an idea of a whiskey that you think the market would like and would be interested in trying out for themselves? Instead of Lee telling a story about himself and what made him so in love with whiskey or what he thought was interesting, the first thing that came to his mind was a story he had heard about Albert Blanton. Now, fun fact, I really have to pay a lot of respects to Elmer T. Lee because funny enough, when he had first applied for this job at the distillery, Albert Blanton had turned him down and had told him, no, I don't think you got it, we don't need you at the time. So for Elmer to, after all this time, come back and say, hey, I have a story, it's about somebody who didn't believe in me, but I think it's something that we should name a whiskey after him and do blah, 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 is like super commendable because I don't know too many people who can do that. I don't know if I could do that. But back to Albert Blanton. The story that Elmer T. Lee told was of the aging Albert Blanton. As he got older and older, would always request his, let's say his employees, to fetch a few barrels for him or some bottles that he would personally enjoy on his own and sometimes give to friends. His instructions are very simple. Find me a barrel of minimum 8-year-old whiskey from warehouse H from the 5th and 6th floor of the warehouse. Why warehouse H? Why 8 years old? Why 5th or 6th floor of the warehouse? That's because these were his favorite profile of whiskey. He was the inventor and the first originator of a single barrel whiskey. Before then, whiskey was all aged in barrels, of course, but then batched together or blended together for a particular flavor profile. Blanton was very specific about the warehouse that he loved his whiskey to be from, what floors he loved his whiskey to be aged and matured in, and the length of time, but more importantly, it should only come from one barrel, was never cut, never filtered, and in most of the cases, he actually would drink it barrel strength. Now, today you can still buy the unfiltered and the barrel strength versions, but you usually don't find them so often, so you're more likely going to find the cut version. So somewhere between, I think it's like 43 or so to 45% ABV. So with this story and this backing of Elmer T. Lee, which would personally pick out these barrels, in 1983, Blanton's was brought to the market. But funny enough, not to the American market. First, Blanton's was actually released in Japan, where it was selling for roughly $100 per bottle. This is at a time where the US was only spending around $10 per bottle, so you can imagine it was much more lucrative, especially in kind of a weaker whiskey economy, to start selling these Blanton special whiskeys overseas to a market that would pay more for it. Nevertheless, it worked. Not only was it very hard to find in Japan, almost always sold out, but it made its way back to the US, with the words written on top for everyone to see, the finest bourbon in the world, comes from one single barrel. Now, you might also hear this, hey, Blanton's, you're paying too much for it. It's not a super unique whiskey. Theoretically, it's made by Buffalo Trace. So if you have a Buffalo Trace whiskey, it's the same. It's the same as Eagle Rare, which I have here with me right now, especially because this one is 10 years old. And here it's 45% alcohol, 90 proof. So Blanton's is kind of similar. Yeah, no, this is a blended whiskey. We don't know which warehouse it came from. We just know the age, and we know pretty much the mash bill, same distillery. But with Blanton's, you're getting something very unique, very special, and something that's been around for a very, very long time. If nothing more, you get to live and be a part of the Albert Blanton story. Now, what's really interesting, kind of two fun facts to leave you with, is number one, Blanton's, however produced by Buffalo Trace, is no longer the brand, or is no longer owned by Buffalo Trace. Blanton's is actually owned by Age International, which is a company which is also then owned by Takara Shuso Co. Probably butchered that. But it's really interesting because although the branding, the rights, all like the patents are all owned by Ancient Aged and this other company, Buffalo Trace will still produce it, make it, and sell it to the market. So it's a really interesting relationship. However, it works, and if you're lucky enough to get your hands on a bottle of Blanton's, you're probably going to enjoy it a lot. One final fact, I'm sure you guys have already seen this, but for those of you which are hearing about Blanton for the very first time, the cork tops, which I don't have with me unfortunately, are collectibles. Now, you can always buy them at the Buffalo Trace distillery. They come with a little marker or a dot at the bottom of the cork, so you know it's purchased, not collected. But if you line them all up side by side, you'll spell out the words Blanton, and you will see the horse in stride. If you get a chance to get your hands on a bottle of Blanton's, do it. Like, I'll give you the example here in Switzerland. These are the prices, and they're almost always out of stock. It's pretty hard to find. Now, in the US, you're going to have a better chance. If you check out the Buffalo Trace distillery, you'll probably have a very good chance of picking up a bottle to try. With that, cheers to you, your next glass of whiskey. Maybe it's a Blanton's, maybe it's a single barrel inspired by Blanton's. Cheers.